The shadows that stretch across your floor tonight are not merely a trick of the light. They are a silent reminder that the world we inhabit is often just a thin, painted veil. We spend our lives constructing walls of safety, convinced that the strange, dark, and mysterious is a phantom of the past or a headline from a city we have never visited, but the truth is far more unsettling. Tonight, we travel to the quiet suburban streets of Youngstown, Ohio, the ancient, blood-soaked soil of Bavaria, and the high-tech digital frontiers of Hong Kong. We are peeling back the skin of the ordinary to reveal the nightmares pulsing just beneath the surface. Our journey begins in the year 2017, in a place where the air was thick with the scent of mown grass and the heavy, suffocating weight of a secret that was slowly turning to ice. The winter of 2017 in Youngstown, Ohio, carried a specific kind of weight, a heavy, leaden gray that settled over the Mahoning Valley like a wet wool blanket. In the small, unassuming houses that lined the streets, the radiators hissed and clattered, fighting back against a wind that smelled of old steel and frozen river water. Among these houses was the home of 28-year-old Shannon Graves. Shannon was the sort of person who seemed to defy the gloom of an Ohio February. She was vibrant, petite, and possessed a laugh that could be heard through the thin walls of the local diners where she was a familiar face. To her friends and family, she was a constant, a bright thread in the fabric of their lives. She spent her mornings in a flurry of small, domestic rituals, grinding coffee beans until the kitchen smelled of roasted earth, letting her dog out into the frosty yard, and checking her reflection in the hallway mirror, unaware that she was looking at a version of herself that was about to be erased. The air inside the home she shared with her boyfriend was often filled with the mundane sounds of a life in progress. The soft thud of a book being closed, the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard, the low murmur of a daytime television show. This was the illusion of normalcy, a stage set where every prop was in its place. To the world outside, Shannon was just another young woman navigating the complexities of her 20s, making plans for a future that stretched out before her like a long, clear highway. But every stage needs a stagehand, and Shannon's life was increasingly managed by a man the neighbors knew as Anthony Gonzalez. Anthony was a figure of quiet competence. If you lived on their street, you might see him out on the porch, his breath blooming in white plumes as he surveyed the neighborhood with a calm, steady gaze. He was the man you'd ask for a jump start if your car battery died in the sub-zero temperatures. He was polite, perhaps a bit reserved, but he carried himself with an air of settled belonging. He was the kind of man who seemed to value the order of things. Neighbors would watch him through their kitchen curtains, seeing him carry groceries into the house or move a trash bin with a nod of acknowledgement to anyone passing by. He was a chameleon, a master of the unremarkable. However, Anthony Gonzalez was merely a skin, a thin, brittle layer of deception. Beneath it lay the true architect of the shadows in that house, Arturo Novoa. Arturo was a man who understood the power of a mask. He knew that if you performed the role of the good neighbor well enough, people would stop looking for what was hidden in the basement or behind the locked doors of the mind. He moved through his days with a cold, internal clockwork, his eyes reflecting not the warmth of the home he shared with Shannon, but a dark, encroaching hunger. He was a man who didn't just live in the shadows, he cultivated them. As the month of February progressed, the mask began to slip in ways that were invisible to the casual observer, but felt like a sudden drop in pressure to those inside. The Anthony that the neighbors saw was still there, shoveling the driveway and offering a brief wave. But inside the house, Arturo was beginning to assert a different kind of presence. The vibrant Shannon was slowly being eclipsed. The coffee stopped brewing. The dog's bark grew infrequent. A thick, suffocating tension began to leak out of the floorboards, a premonition of the violence that was about to tear through the fabric of their quiet Ohio lives. The predator had spent years building his cage of normalcy, and now he was ready to step inside it with his prey. The transition from a living, breathing household to a tomb happens in a heartbeat, yet the echoes of that moment linger for an eternity. In the fading light of a cold February evening in 2017, the normalcy of the Youngstown residence was shattered, with a suddenness that defied the quiet of the street outside. There was no grand struggle that the neighbors could hear, no crashing of furniture or shattered glass to alert the world that Shannon Graves was in peril. Instead, it was a sequence of small, clinical movements, the heavy slide of a bolt, the sharp intake of breath, and then a silence so profound it felt as though the very oxygen had been sucked out of the room. In that split second, the man Shannon knew as her partner, the man the neighborhood called Anthony, discarded the last remnants of his human mask. The violence was not a chaotic explosion. It was a targeted, forceful erasure. Imagine the sound of a heavy door closing for the last time, the metallic click of a lock engaging, and the realization that the person you trusted most has become a stranger. For Shannon, the world narrowed down to the immediate, terrifying presence of Arturo Novoa. Then the chaos began. Not the loud, frantic chaos of a public emergency, but the suffocating internal chaos of a disappearance. One moment, Shannon was there, a fixture of the community, a daughter, a friend. The next, she was simply gone. Her car remained in the driveway, a ghost of her daily routine. Her phone, once a conduit for laughter and plans, went dark. To the people who loved her, it was as if she had stepped behind a curtain and the stage had gone black. In the days that followed, the house on Ravenwood Avenue became a fortress of secrets. Arturo, still draped in his alias of Anthony Gonzalez, moved through the neighborhood with a chilling, practiced ease. He didn't flee, he didn't hide in the traditional sense. Instead, he hid in plain sight, maintaining the rhythm of his life while the woman he had shared it with was missing. The initial chaos was muffled by the mundane, the sound of a television at a normal volume, the routine of taking out the trash, the polite nods to passersby who had no idea that the man they were waving to was standing in the center of a nightmare. No screams had reached the neighbors' ears because the walls were thick and the perpetrator was meticulous. There were no signs of a struggle visible from the sidewalk. The disappearance was absolute, a void where a life used to be, leaving Shannon's family to scream into a silence that Arturo Novoa had carefully engineered to remain unbroken. Arturo Novoa was not a man ruled by the heat of a moment. He was a creature of cold, calculated architecture. To understand the dark side of this predator, one must look at the basement of his mind, a place where empathy had been replaced by a mechanical, almost industrial need for control. He did not merely want Shannon Graves dead. He wanted her to never have existed. This was not a crime of passion, it was a project of total erasure. The predator's true nature was revealed in the days following the disappearance, when he brought a new woman, Katrina Layton, into the home. This was a psychological hijacking of the most twisted order. While the investigation into Shannon's whereabouts was beginning to stall, Katrina was upstairs, moving through the rooms like a ghost of the woman she had replaced. She wore Shannon's clothes, she drove Shannon's car, and she even took over the care of Shannon's beloved dog. It was as if Arturo had simply swapped one soul for another, treating the vibrant life of a human being as nothing more than a lease that had expired. But beneath the floorboards, the work was ongoing. Arturo and Katrina were not just hiding a body, they were attempting to unmake it. They had transformed their living space into a laboratory of the macabre. They procured large quantities of corrosive acid, envisioning a scenario where Shannon Graves would simply dissolve into a liquid memory. Imagine the scene, the dim yellow light of the basement flickering against damp concrete walls. The air is no longer filled with the scent of roasted coffee, but with the acrid metallic sting of chemicals that burns the back of the throat. Arturo and Katrina stood over large containers, watching as the acid hissed and bubbled, trying to force the physical world to obey their will. But the human body is stubbornly resilient, even in death. The acid failed to complete the task, leaving behind a gruesome, half-finished problem that required a more hands-on approach. This failure did not lead to a frantic confession or a panicked flight. Instead, it led to a more chilling, mechanical solution. With the same clinical detachment one might use to take apart a piece of machinery, Arturo and Katrina began the process of dismemberment. They worked with the grim precision of butchers, reducing a woman who was loved and missed into segments that could be easily transported and hidden. Their preparation was meticulous. They sought out a locked chest, a freezer to act as a temporary tomb. They didn't hide it in their own home, which they knew might eventually be searched. Instead, they used their social capital, their mask of being good people, to convince a friend to store the locked unit in their own basement. They told a lie about a broken appliance and a need for space. A lie so mundane that no one thought to question the heavy, padlocked box that was moved into the shadows of a neighboring house. This was the Predator's greatest strength, the ability to weave a nightmare into the very fabric of the ordinary. The search for Shannon Graves in the early months of 2017 was a masterclass in frustration. Inside the Youngstown Police Department, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the silent pressure of a case that was rapidly cooling. Detectives combed through her phone records, spoke to her friends, and retraced her final known steps, but every path led back to a brick wall. There were no frantic withdrawals from her bank account, no pings from cell towers in distant cities, and no witnesses who had seen her leave the house on Ravenwood Avenue. The police deadlock was not born of a lack of effort, but of a series of minor, cumulative errors and the overwhelming weight of the normalcy Arturo Novoa had manufactured. Because he was known to everyone as Anthony Gonzalez, the polite, quiet neighbor, the police didn't initially treat the home as a primary crime scene. There was no probable cause to tear up the floorboards of a man who seemed to be cooperating with their inquiries. When officers spoke to him, Arturo was the picture of steady, helpful concern. He offered theories, shared memories, and played the role of the confused boyfriend so well that he redirected the investigative gaze away from his own front door. This was the psychological barrier that protected the predator. The community of Youngstown, like any close-knit neighborhood, struggled to reconcile the image of the helpful Anthony with the reality of a killer. There was a collective, unspoken refusal to see the darkness. Even as Katrina Layton moved into Shannon's life, stepping into her shoes, driving her car, and walking her dog, the neighbors watched from behind their curtains and rationalized it. They told themselves it was a quick rebound, or perhaps Shannon had simply left under strange circumstances. The human mind is designed to seek the path of least resistance, and the idea that a woman had been erased and replaced was a path too terrifying to walk. This social silence became Arturo's greatest shield. While Shannon's family pleaded for answers and organized search parties through the damp Ohio woods, the man responsible was sitting on his porch, watching them with a calm, detached interest. The investigation became a series of almosts. Almost a lead on a sighting in another town. Almost a forensic hit on a piece of discarded clothing. But as spring turned to the sweltering heat of summer, the case file for Shannon Graves sat on the edge of the cold case cabinet. The digital trail had gone silent, the physical evidence was non-existent, and the predator had successfully retreated into the virtual and social shadows he had created. It seemed as though Arturo Novoa had committed the perfect crime, an erasure so complete that time itself was beginning to wash away the memory of Shannon's presence. But time, as it turns out, is a double-edged sword. While it can bury a secret, it also exerts a slow, relentless pressure on the containers we use to hide our sins. As the calendar turned to July of 2017, the deadlock was about to be broken by the most mundane of human needs: hunger. July of 2017 arrived with a sweltering, oppressive heat that seemed to bake the secrets right out of the Ohio soil. Across town, in a home belonging to an acquaintance of the man they knew as Anthony, a mundane domestic problem was brewing. It was a Sunday, the kind of day meant for backyard barbecues and the heavy, sweet scent of charred charcoal. The owners of the house had been doing a favor for Arturo Novoa, keeping a large, padlocked chest freezer in their basement for months. Arturo had told them his electricity was unreliable, and he needed a place to store his extra meat. It was a small request, the kind of thing friends do without a second thought. But on this particular afternoon, the couple's own refrigerator was bare. They remembered the freezer downstairs, the one Arturo had never come back to check on. They reached out to him, asking for the key to the heavy padlock that guarded the lid, but Arturo was elusive, offering excuses that shifted like sand. Eventually, driven by a simple, gnawing hunger and a growing sense of curiosity, they decided they couldn't wait any longer. They descended into the cool, damp shadows of their basement. The air was thick with the smell of laundry detergent and old concrete. There, sitting in the corner like a silent white monolith, was the freezer. The padlock was a heavy, silver-gray sentinel. One of them gripped a pair of bolt cutters, the metal cold and unyielding in their hands. With a sharp, industrial snap, the lock gave way, hitting the floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the quiet house. The lid was heavy, resisting at first as the seal of frozen condensation broke with a rhythmic tearing sound. They expected to see neatly wrapped packages of beef or venison. Instead, as the lid swung open, they were met with a sight that froze the blood in their veins. Inside, beneath a thin layer of frost, were several black garbage bags. They weren't filled with food. As they shifted the bags, the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet scent of decay began to bloom in the confined space of the basement, a smell that no amount of cold could truly mask. The turning point had arrived not through a brilliant piece of detective work, but through the sheer random fluke of a Sunday dinner. The police were called, and as the sirens wailed through the suburban streets, the mask Arturo Novoa had worn for months finally disintegrated. Forensic teams, clad in white suits that looked like lunar gear against the grimy basement walls, carefully removed the remains. DNA testing soon provided the tragic confirmation that the authorities had feared the dismembered body inside the freezer belonged to Shannon Graves. The predator's meticulous plan had been thwarted by the one thing he couldn't control, the simple human necessity of a neighbor looking for a meal. The courtroom in 2019 felt like a vacuum, a place where the air was thick with the unsaid and the heavy, wooden scent of a system trying to balance a scale that could never truly be even. Arturo Novoa, the man who had effortlessly worn the skin of Anthony Gonzalez for so long, sat at the defense table. He no longer looked like the helpful neighbor who would jumpstart your car on a frozen Ohio morning. The mask had been stripped away by the relentless light of the legal process, leaving behind a man who seemed diminished, yet entirely devoid of the remorse that usually fills a room of such gravity. When the judge finally spoke, the words were like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. For the murder of Shannon Graves, for the clinical dismemberment of her body, and for the psychological torment he had inflicted upon a community that once trusted him, Arturo Novoa was sentenced to 48 years in prison. It was a number that felt both massive and insufficient. 48 years of cold meals and steel bars, a stark contrast to the vibrant, sunny life of the woman he had reduced to a secret in a basement freezer. As for Katrina Layton, the woman who had stepped into Shannon's clothes and walked her dog while the acid bubbled in the basement, her role in this nightmare remains a chilling footnote in the annals of Youngstown's history. The psychological grip Arturo held over those around him was so profound that it left investigators wondering where the manipulation ended and the complicity began. The house on Ravenwood Avenue eventually saw new occupants, and the grass grew back over the yard where the dog used to play, but the neighborhood changed forever. The couple who had used bolt cutters to open that padlocked freezer on a hungry Sunday afternoon would never again look at a locked door without a shiver of apprehension. The simple act of preparing a meal had been permanently tainted by the memory of black plastic bags and the sickeningly sweet scent of a life that had been hidden away in the dark. Justice, in the end, was a clinical thing. It provided a cell and a sentence, but it could not restore the laughter to the diners of the Mahoning Valley or erase the images that haunt the dreams of those who knew the good neighbor named Anthony. The lesson left behind in the wake of Arturo Novoa is a grim one. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones who hide under the bed, but the ones who wave to you from across the street, their hands steady, their smiles practiced, and their basements locked tight. But while Shannon's story found its cold conclusion in the hands of the law, there are other tales where the predator is never truly caught, where they linger in the periphery like a ghost, watching and waiting. To find our next story, we must leave the modern suburbs of Ohio and travel back over a century to a place where the silence is even deeper, and the snow hides secrets that no amount of time can thaw. We are going to a small, isolated farm in Bavaria, Germany in the year 1922, where a family began to notice a set of tracks that led from the dark woods directly to their front door, but never led back out. The air in the Bavarian countryside in March of 1922 did not just carry a chill, it carried a warning. To the residents of the small town of Kaifeck, the world felt vast, yet their lives were tethered to the rhythm of the soil and the encroaching shadows of the surrounding woods. Located approximately 1 hour north of Munich, the farm known as Hinterkaifeck sat like a lonely outpost, nearly 500 meters removed from the main road. It was a cluster of timber and stone buildings, a house, a barn, and a stable, all huddled together as if trying to keep warm against the biting winds that swept across the flat, gray plains. Life at Hinterkaifeck was defined by a brutal, repetitive normalcy. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, was a man carved from the very hardwood of the forest. He was stern, reclusive, and deeply disliked by the local community. His wife, 72-year-old Cecilia, was a woman of few words, her face a map of decades spent battling the elements. They lived there with their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. To an outsider, the sight of the family working the fields or tending to the cattle was the epitome of rural stability. You would see the steam rising from the cow's breath in the morning light, hear the rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting logs, and smell the heavy, earthy scent of manure and damp hay. This was the illusion of normalcy, a domestic fortress built on hard work and isolation. But beneath this veneer of productivity, a different kind of architecture was being built. The neighbors viewed the Grubers not with affection, but with a guarded curiosity. Andreas was known for his prickly nature, a man who preferred the company of his livestock to the gossip of the village tavern. This isolation served as the perfect mask for a predator, though at first, the predator was not a person, but a series of inexplicable events. The first crack in the family's reality appeared 6 months earlier when their previous maid abruptly quit. She didn't leave because of the low pay or the grueling labor. She fled in the middle of the night, claiming the house was haunted. She spoke of footsteps in the attic when no one was there, and the feeling of eyes watching her from the dark corners of the barn. Andreas, a man of cold logic, had dismissed her fears as the ramblings of a superstitious girl. He believed in what he could touch, what he could farm, and what he could kill. However, as the final days of March arrived, even Andreas could no longer ignore the anomalies. One morning, he found a newspaper on the porch, a paper from Munich that no one in the family had subscribed to and no mailman had delivered. A few days later, he discovered a set of keys to the house had vanished into thin air. He searched every drawer and every coat pocket, his frustration growing with the silence of the house. Then came the scratches on the lock of the tool shed, as if someone had been trying to pick it with a steady, practiced hand. The most chilling omen, however, appeared on a morning when the ground was still blanketed in a fresh, pristine layer of snow. Andreas stepped out of the back door to find a trail of footprints leading from the edge of the dark, dense woods directly toward the farm buildings. They were deep, clear, and unmistakably human. He followed them with his eyes, his heart hammering a slow, rhythmic thud against his ribs. The tracks led straight to the back of the house, but as he circled the property, searching for where they exited, he found nothing. There were no returning prints. No trail leading back into the safety of the trees. Whoever had walked out of those woods was now somewhere inside the perimeter of his life. Instead of calling the police, Andreas retreated into his characteristic silence, perhaps too proud or too stubborn to admit that his fortress had been breached. He spent his nights listening to the settling of the house, the groaning of the wooden beams, and the scratching in the attic that sounded less and less like rats. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm, carrying her few belongings in a small valise. She was greeted by the mundane sounds of a family preparing for the evening, the clinking of pails, the low lowing of the cattle, and the settling of the winter sun. She had no way of knowing that she had just walked into a tomb, or that the ghost the previous maid feared was currently watching her through a knothole in the ceiling, waiting for the sun to drop below the horizon. The night of March 31st, 1922, did not descend upon the Bavarian plains with a gentle touch. It fell like a heavy, suffocating shroud. As the sun dipped below the jagged line of the forest, the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl through the narrow gaps in the Hinterkaifeck farm buildings. Inside the main house, the family had finished their evening meal, a simple affair of bread and broth. The clatter of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls had been the only rhythm in the room, a domestic soundtrack that gave no hint of the violence lurking just beyond the doorframe. Outside, in the sprawling, dark barn, the atmosphere had shifted. The cattle, usually lulled into a quiet hum by this hour, were restless. Their low, mournful moans carried across the courtyard, a sound of animal distress that cut through the whistling wind. Andreas Gruber, standing by the kitchen window, watched the shadows dance across the snow. He remembered the footprints that led toward his home, but never away. He felt a cold, sharp prickle at the base of his neck, the primal instinct of a man who knows he is no longer the only predator on his land. He grabbed his lantern and a heavy wool coat, the fabric stiff with the cold. He stepped out into the biting air, the snow crunching beneath his heavy boots, a rhythmic, lonely sound in the vast silence of the Bavarian night. He walked toward the barn, the yellow light of his lantern swinging in wide, frantic arcs that momentarily illuminated the skeletal branches of the trees. He was a man of 63 years, hardened by labor, yet in this moment he felt the weight of every winter he had ever endured. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the stable, the hinges let out a long, metallic groan that seemed to echo into the very rafters. The air inside was deceptively warm, thick with the scent of dry hay and the musky, humid heat of the animals. Andreas stepped into the darkness, raising his lantern to check the stalls. He did not see the figure standing in the shadows of the hayloft. He did not see the glint of the mattock, a heavy, two-sided pickaxe as it caught the dim, flickering light. In a split second, the illusion of the quiet evening was shattered. There was no grand struggle, no heroic stand. There was only the sudden, forceful movement of a shadow. The mattock descended with a dull, heavy thwack of steel meeting bone. Andreas fell into the straw without a word, his lantern shattering against the floorboards and spilling oil that hissed and sputtered before dying out completely. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. One by one, the rest of the family was lured into the barn, drawn by the strange, quiet, or perhaps a muffled sound that only a mother's ear could catch. Cecilia, the 72-year-old matriarch, was the next to enter the darkness. Then came their daughter, Victoria, and finally, 7-year-old Tezilia. Each stepped into the barn expecting to find a husband, a father, or a grandfather. Instead, they were met by the same cold, mechanical violence. The screams of the victims were swallowed by the thick stone walls of the stable and the relentless driving wind that masked the sounds of the slaughter from the distant village. Inside the farmhouse, Maria Baumgartner, the new maid who had arrived only hours earlier, was settling into her small Spartan room. She was busy unpacking her few belongings into a dresser that would soon become a silent witness to her end. She heard nothing of the horror in the barn. In the nursery, 2-year-old Joseph lay in his wooden cot, his breathing rhythmic and peaceful, unaware that the shadow from the woods had finally come inside. The initial chaos was over in a matter of minutes, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt as though the farm itself had stopped breathing, leaving only the sound of the wind and the soft, rhythmic thud of the predator's footsteps as he moved toward the house to finish what he had started. The darkness of the predator at Hinterkaifeck was not found in a sudden explosion of rage, but in a cold, patient endurance that defies human understanding. To truly see into the shadows of this individual's mind, we have to look up past the heavy oak beams of the ceiling and into the suffocating, dust-choked crawl space of the attic. This was the killer's true domain. For days, perhaps even weeks, a human being had been living directly above the heads of the Gruber family. He had been a silent tenant in their home, a shadow that moved only when they slept. The preparation was not a matter of building secret rooms or soundproofing walls. It was a matter of total invisible immersion. Imagine the killer lying flat on the rough-hewn attic floorboards, his ear pressed against the wood. He would have heard the rhythmic clink of silverware during dinner, the low, guttural arguments between Andreas and Victoria, and the soft, innocent laughter of 7-year-old Cecilia. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to know them. He watched them through small gaps in the floorboard's knotholes that acted as camera lenses into their private world. He knew exactly which board creaked, which door was left unlocked, and precisely when the heavy silence of sleep settled over the house. The footprints in the snow were not a mistake. They were a chilling testament to his boldness. He had walked out of the woods and into their lives, knowing he had no intention of leaving. His weapon of choice was a mattock, a heavy, two-sided tool used for breaking hard ground. It was a common farm implement, something he likely found right there on the property. This choice speaks to a psychological economy. He used the family's own tools to dismantle their lives. But the true horror of his psychology emerged after the violence in the barn was complete. Most killers flee the scene, driven by adrenaline or the fear of discovery. This predator did the opposite. He stayed. For several days after he had ended the lives of 6 people, he moved into the farmhouse as if he were the rightful heir to the property. He didn't hide in the attic anymore. He walked through the kitchen, his boots clicking on the floorboards where the family's blood was still fresh. He sat at their table and ate the bread they had baked. He drank their milk and used their stove to keep the Bavarian chill at bay. There is a mechanical, almost pastoral quality to his actions during those days. Neighbors would later report seeing smoke rising from the chimney long after the family had been murdered. The cattle in the barn were not left to starve. The killer walked among the bodies of his victims to ensure the livestock were fed and watered. He maintained the rhythm of the farm while the owners lay in a heap in the straw. It was as if he had stepped into a role, a grotesque imitation of a farmer living a quiet, domestic life in the center of a graveyard. This was a man who felt no heat from his crimes, only a cold, hollow satisfaction in the order of his new, silent world. The sun rose over the Bavarian landscape on the morning of April 1st, 1922, but it failed to burn away the thick, gray mist that clung to the lowlands surrounding the village of Groburn. In any other year, this would have been a day of renewed activity, a time for neighbors to call out to one another across the stone fences as they prepared for the spring planting. But the silence emanating from the Hinterkaifeck farm was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy structural void that seemed to push back against the curiosity of the outside world. The police deadlock in the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders didn't begin with a lack of evidence at a crime scene, because for 4 long days, the authorities didn't even know a crime had been committed. This was a deadlock of perception, a social and psychological barrier built out of the prickly, isolationist reputation of Andreas Gruber. In a small, devout community where everyone's business was common knowledge, the Grubers were an island of cold indifference. People didn't check on Andreas not because they didn't notice his absence, but because his very presence was something most neighbors preferred to avoid. As the days ticked by, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, the missed signals began to pile up like the unread newspapers on the farmhouse porch. On Saturday, 7-year-old Cecilia failed to show up for school. Her desk sat empty, a small wooden island in a room full of children, but in 1922, a child missing school on a farm was often dismissed as a need for extra hands in the fields. On Sunday, the most glaring red flag of all occurred. The entire family was absent from church. In the deeply religious heart of Bavaria, missing Sunday Mass was equivalent to a public alarm bell. The villagers whispered in the pews, glancing toward the back of the church where the Grubers usually sat in grim silence. Yet no one walked the 500 meters to the farm to ask why. The reason for this hesitation was the terrifyingly effective living facade maintained by the predator. While 6 people lay dead, 5 in the cold straw of the barn and 1 in a small cot inside the house, the farm itself continued to breathe. From the vantage point of the distant road, everything looked normal. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, suggesting a warm hearth and a meal being prepared. The cattle did not low in hunger or distress because the killer, moving with a chillingly domestic rhythm, walked among the corpses to ensure the animals were fed and watered. He was a ghost, performing the duties of a farmer, using the mundane chores of rural life to create a psychological shield that kept the world at bay. The postman, piling up mail that was never collected, felt the prickle of unease but stayed his hand. Neighbors noticed the lack of movement in the yard, but they saw the smoke and heard the rhythmic clink of the farm equipment, and they rationalized the silence. This was the power of the normal mask. The predator knew that as long as the chimney smoked and the cows were quiet, the community would remain behind its wall of polite, guarded distance. The search efforts only began in earnest on April 4th, 4 days after the last breath had been drawn at Hinterkaifeck. A mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm to repair a stationary engine. He spent 5 hours on the property, working in the yard and the barn. He saw no one. He heard only the barking of the family dog, which had been tied up and left to watch over a graveyard. When he returned to the village and reported that the farm felt empty despite the motor running and the dog barking, the final psychological thread snapped. The villagers finally gathered their courage, arming themselves with pitchforks and clubs, and began the slow, dread-filled trek toward the farmhouse. They were not walking into a mystery. They were walking into a 4-day-old nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight by a man who understood that the best way to hide a murder is to keep the home fires burning. The afternoon of April 4th, 1922, was the moment the heavy, suffocating silence of Hinterkaifeck finally began to crack under the weight of its own secrets. It did not happen with a dramatic scream or a sudden, tearful confession, but with the steady, rhythmic clicking of a repairman's tools echoing through the empty courtyard. A mechanic had been hired to fix a stationary engine on the property, and he had spent over 4 hours working alone in the shadows of the barn. He had seen no one. He had heard only the wind and the unsettling silence of a farm that should have been bustling with the activity of 6 people. When he returned to the village, his report of the ghostly emptiness of the property, despite the engine running and the chimney smoking, sent a ripple of genuine fear through the community of Groburn. A small group of men, neighbors who had spent days rationalizing the Grubers' absence, finally gathered their resolve as the sun began to dip behind the jagged black line of the forest. They approached the farmstead with a mixture of duty and dread, their lanterns casting long, shivering shadows across the remains of the winter snow. The air was bitingly cold, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots on the frozen earth, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the oppressive stillness of the plains. As they reached the perimeter, they saw the family dog, a loyal creature that had been tied up for days, howling a low, mournful vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground itself. The men entered the barn first, the heavy wooden doors groaning on their hinges like a warning. The interior was a cavern of shadows, thick with the scent of dry hay, animal musk, and a new, terrifyingly sweet odor of decay that made the men press their handkerchiefs to their faces. As the golden light of their lanterns swept across the straw, it illuminated a sight that would haunt the village for a century. Stacked in the corner, hidden beneath a makeshift covering of old door panels and loose hay, were the bodies of Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia. They had been struck down with a clinical mechanical force, their lives ended by a kuik chim, a heavy mattock that belonged to the farm itself. The turning point of the discovery was the realization that this was not a fresh crime, but a massacre that had been aging in the dark for 4 days. The extreme tension of the search party escalated as they moved from the barn toward the farmhouse, their boots clicking on the stone path where the killer had walked only hours before. Inside the house, the horror was personalized. In the small Spartan bedroom of the maid, they found Maria Baumgartner, who had been murdered within her first few hours on the job. And in the nursery lay the most heart-wrenching sight of all, 2-year-old Joseph killed in his wooden cot. But it was the evidence of the killer's residence that truly broke the spirit of the men. In the kitchen, they found that the stove was still warm, the embers of a fire still glowing deep in the grate. On the wooden table sat the remnants of a meal, bread crusts, and a half-emptied bowl of soup that had been eaten recently. The realization hit them like a physical blow. For 4 days, while 6 bodies lay cold and stiff just feet away, a predator had been living there. He had slept in their beds, eaten their food, and even walked into the barn to feed and water the cattle, maintaining the illusion of life while surrounded by the evidence of his own slaughter. This was the random fluke that finally exposed the truth. Not a mistake in the killing, but the arrogance of a man who chose to play the role of the homeowner in a graveyard. As they stood in the kitchen, the neighbors remembered the warning Andreas had shared days prior about the footprints in the snow that led into the farm but never back out. They realized with sickening clarity that the predator had arrived as a set of tracks and had remained as a living shadow right under their noses. No matter how meticulously he had hidden the bodies, the silence of the people and the noise of the animals had eventually created a gap that the world could no longer ignore. The killer had vanished back into the dark woods just before the lanterns arrived, leaving behind a farm that was no longer a home, but a monument to a force of nature that was as cold and unyielding as the Bavarian winter. The aftermath of the discovery at Hinterkaifeck was not a moment of clarity, but a descent into a cold, bureaucratic frustration that mirrored the icy Bavarian landscape. In the days following the grim discovery, the farm was transformed from a site of labor into a theater of the macabre. Investigators from Munich arrived, their heavy wool coats sweeping through the straw where the 4 bodies had been stacked like firewood. Because the technology of 1922 was limited, the autopsies were performed right there on the property, in the very barn where the family had drawn their final breaths. The air was thick with the scent of lye, cold stone, and the metallic tang of the mattock that had served as the killer's instrument. The fate of the individuals involved was a tally of absolute loss. 6 lives: Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, 7-year-old Cecilia, baby Joseph, and the maid Maria had been extinguished by a predator who had essentially moved into their lives before he ended them. The investigation itself became a monument to futility. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, ranging from traveling salesmen to disgruntled neighbors and even former lovers, but every lead eventually dissolved into the gray mist of the Bavarian plains. The most haunting realization for the authorities was the timeline. The killer had stayed on the farm for several days after the murders, eating the family's food and tending to their livestock while the corpses remained in the barn. He had been a ghost in the machine of their daily lives, a shadow that had finally stepped out of the attic to claim the house for himself. Ultimately, justice proved to be an elusive specter. No one was ever charged with the massacre at Hinterkaifeck. The farm, stained by a darkness that no amount of scrubbing could remove, was eventually demolished in 1923. Today, all that remains is a small stone memorial in the middle of a quiet field, a lonely marker for a crime that defied the logic of the world. The lesson of Hinterkaifeck is a chilling one. Sometimes, the locks on our doors and the walls of our homes are not enough to keep the outside world out. Sometimes, the threat has already walked through the snow, followed the tracks to your porch, and is simply waiting for you to look the other way. But while the monster of Hinterkaifeck was a physical presence that lived in the rafters, some predators prefer to watch from the periphery, using the power of words and the weight of a secret to dismantle a life. The fear of being observed, of a stranger knowing the intimate rhythms of your home, did not die in 1922. It simply migrated across the ocean. We move now to the manicured lawns and white-shingled houses of Westfield, New Jersey in the year 2014. A young family had just purchased what they believed was their forever home, unaware that someone had been claiming ownership of that property and every soul within it for many, many decades. The sun dappled through the centuries-old oaks of Westfield, New Jersey. in the early summer of 2014. It was a town that smelled of freshly cut grass and expensive perfume, a place where the American dream had not just been realized, it had been polished to a mirror finish. In June of that year, Derek and Maria Broaddus were standing on the threshold of their own personal masterpiece, a house located at 657 Boulevard. The house was a sprawling, shingle-style Dutch colonial, a stately sentinel that had watched over the neighborhood since 1905. It possessed high ornate ceilings, deep-set windows that invited the morning light, and a front porch that practically begged for a rocking chair and a glass of lemonade. To Derek and Maria, this was more than just a real estate transaction. It was the forever home they had spent years of hard work and careful saving to achieve. They were not just buying a building, they were securing a future for their 3 young children, a place envisioned for backyard birthday parties, hide and seek in the many rooms, and quiet Christmas mornings by the fireplace. Their initial days were filled with the happy, exhausting chaos of a new move. You could hear the rhythmic thwap-thwap of paint rollers against the walls of the upstairs bedrooms as they began to make the space their own. The air inside was thick with the scent of primer and the fine, floating dust of sawdust as contractors moved through the halls, updating the kitchen and refinishing the dark hardwood floors. Derek would often stop by the house after a long day at work, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, just to stand in the center of the living room and breathe in the quiet potential of the space. He would look out the large front windows at the boulevard, watching the joggers and the occasional cyclist pass by, feeling a profound and hard-earned sense of arrival. This was the pinnacle of normalcy, the gold standard of a life well lived in the American suburbs. But while the Broaddus family was looking out at their new world, someone else was looking in. The predator in this story did not have a face that the neighbors could easily identify over a backyard fence. Instead, the mask was the very fabric of the town itself. Westfield was a place defined by quiet, constant observation. Neighbors watched neighbors, not out of any apparent malice, but out of a shared, deep-seated commitment to the aesthetic and social order of their community. To the people living on the boulevard, the new owners of 657 were simply another young, successful couple adding their own chapter to the long history of the house. They saw the moving vans arrive, they saw the contractors' trucks lining the curb, and they saw the children running across the lush green lawn. They saw the for sale sign come down and the realization of a dream begin. Yet hidden within this collective neighborly gaze was a singular dark focus. Somewhere among the manicured hedges and the stately colonial facades, a figure was standing not with a weapon in hand, but with a pen. This individual did not need to break a window or pick a physical lock. They had already bypassed the physical walls of the house in their mind. They claimed a lineage and a purpose that stretched back through the decades, a connection to the very wood and stone of the structure that the Broaddus family, as newcomers, could never hope to understand. This person, the one who would eventually sign their correspondence as the Watcher, was not just a neighbor. They were a self-appointed guardian of a dark secret that the house at 657 Boulevard was about to whisper to its new, unsuspecting inhabitants. To the rest of the street, this person looked like any other resident. A quiet retiree, a lonely technician, or perhaps a friendly face at the local grocery store. But behind that mask of suburban banality lay an obsession that was about to turn the Broaddus family's dream into a living, waking nightmare. The transition from a dream to a waking nightmare didn't happen with the sound of a breaking window or the heavy tread of a boot on a floorboard. In the quiet, affluent world of Westfield, New Jersey, in June of 2014, the intrusion was far more subtle, arriving in the most mundane of ways, through the mail slot. Derek Broaddus was at the house alone that evening, the air thick with the scent of fresh paint and the humid summer stillness that settles over the suburbs after dinner. He was doing a final walkthrough of the renovations, checking the progress in the upstairs bedrooms where his 3 children would soon sleep. As he headed toward the door to leave for the night, he noticed a thick white envelope sitting in the mailbox. It was addressed simply to the new owner. There was no return address, no stamp, just a piece of heavy ivory cardstock that felt strangely weighted in his hand. Derek opened it, expecting perhaps a warm welcome from a neighbor or a solicitation from a local landscaping company. But as his eyes scanned the typed words, the warm summer air in the hallway seemed to turn to ice. The letter was not a greeting. It was a manifesto of ownership. The author identified themselves only as the Watcher and claimed that the house at 657 Boulevard had been the focus of their family for decades. The writer claimed their grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, their father watched it in the 1960s, and now it was their turn. The sudden incident was the realization that their private lives were already public knowledge to a stranger. The letter didn't just mention the house, it mentioned the broadest children. It asked if the parents had brought young blood to the house, a phrase that sent a primal shiver down Derek's spine. The writer knew the nicknames of the kids. They knew which floor the children would be sleeping on. They asked if the children were too afraid to go into the basement yet, or if they would sleep in the attic. It was a surgical strike against the family's sense of safety, delivered in a calm, almost rhythmic prose that suggested the author was watching the house even as Derek read the page. The initial chaos was not a loud, frantic event, but a suffocating internal panic. Derek didn't scream, he didn't run. He stood frozen in the center of the foyer, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he looked out the large front windows. Outside, the boulevard was peaceful. A neighbor was walking a dog. A car drove slowly past. But now, every figure was a suspect. Every window in the surrounding houses felt like an unblinking eye. The silence of the neighborhood, once a sign of prestige and peace, now felt like a conspiracy of onlookers. Derek immediately called the police, but the arrival of the patrol car, with its flashing lights muted in the twilight, only served to highlight the futility of their position. There were no fingerprints on the envelope. There were no security cameras that had captured a person walking up to the mailbox. The threat was untraceable, a ghost that had manifested through the mail. As the officers took the report, Derek realized that the forever home he had just purchased was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, and his family were the unwilling actors in a play directed by a shadow that claimed to know every corner of the structure better than they ever would. The dream of 657 Boulevard had been hollowed out in a single afternoon, replaced by the terrifying certainty that they were being hunted by a pen and a pair of binoculars. The mind of the Watcher was a labyrinth, constructed from brick, mortar, and a toxic generational obsession. This was not a common criminal looking for a quick score. This was a meticulous architect of fear, who had spent decades, perhaps even their entire life, studying the 657 Boulevard property like a sacred text. To this individual, the house was not just a structure of wood and glass, it was a living, breathing entity that required a specific kind of nourishment. The predator's psychology was rooted in a terrifying sense of entitlement, a belief that they were the true owner of the home's history, and that any new family was merely an intruder in a long-running play. Their preparation was staggering in its quiet intensity. While Derek and Maria were busy picking out paint colors and imagining where the sofa would go, the predator was cataloging the intimate rhythms of their lives. The letters revealed that the Watcher knew exactly which windows belonged to which children and which contractors were inside the house at any given hour. This was not someone who just glanced at the house while driving by. This was someone who sat in the shadows, perhaps behind a curtain in a neighboring attic, or parked in a nondescript car, documenting every arrival and departure. They had mapped out the house's internal geography from the outside, claiming to know the secrets hidden behind the walls, the spaces where things could be hidden. The dark side of this predator was most evident in their use of psychological warfare. They did not threaten a physical break-in, they threatened a spiritual occupation. By claiming their grandfather and father had also watched the house, they were asserting a presence that spanned nearly a century. They spoke of the house inviting the children in, using chilling language to describe the need for fresh blood, a phrase that transformed the beautiful colonial into a predatory organism. This shows a mind that had completely merged with the property, viewing the children not as human beings, but as offerings to the house itself. The preparation involved a deep, disturbing patience, a willingness to wait for the perfect moment to strike with a pen, knowing that a few typed sentences could do more damage than any physical blow. They understood that in a place like Westfield, the greatest weapon is the loss of anonymity and the sudden, crushing realization that you are never, ever alone. Consider the mental discipline required to maintain such a focused gaze for so long. Most people's attention flickers. They get bored or distracted by their own lives. But for the Watcher, the house at 657 Boulevard was the sun around which their entire universe revolved. This is the psychology of a stalker, who has elevated their target to the level of an idol. They did not just observe, they curated the fear. They waited until the family was at their most vulnerable, the moment of buying the dream, to reveal the nightmare. Their secret basement was not necessarily a physical room they had dug out, but rather the mental space they occupied within the neighborhood's social fabric. They were soundproofing their own identity by blending perfectly into the background of Westfield. They understood the social codes of the town so well that they could operate in total silence, a predator hidden in the light of day. Their preparation involved a mastery of the postal system, a way to deliver their bile directly into the heart of the home without ever leaving a trace of themselves. Every letter was a calculated move in a grand game of chess, designed to checkmate the family's sanity before they could even unpack their first box. The letters even mentioned that the house was crying out for young blood, a detail that suggests the predator viewed themselves as the house's voice. This level of delusion indicates a total detachment from the reality of property ownership. To the Watcher, the legal deed held by the Broaddus family was a piece of trash. The only true deed was the one written in the decades of observation and the blood of the lineage they claimed to represent. This was a meticulously planned assault on the very concept of home, transforming a sanctuary into a cage of surveillance. The investigation into the shadow-haunting 657 Boulevard soon became a masterclass in professional impotence. Inside the Westfield Police Department, the air was thick with the smell of scorched coffee and the mounting weight of dead-end files. The detectives assigned to the case stared at the heavy, ivory-colored stationery until the typed characters blurred into a meaningless haze of ink. They had sent the envelopes to high-tech laboratories, hoping for a stray hair, a microscopic flake of skin, or a trace of DNA on the adhesive seal that would finally put a face to the nightmare. But the forensic reports returned like echoes in an empty hall, blank, sterile, and utterly void of a suspect. The predator was operating with a clinical, almost supernatural precision, moving through the world without leaving a single physical footprint. The police deadlock was compounded by a powerful, invisible barrier, the social architecture of Westfield itself. This was not a community where neighbors turned on one another. It was a place where the preservation of the status quo was a sacred duty. When investigators moved house to house along the boulevard, knocking on heavy oak doors and standing on manicured porches, they were met with a wall of polite, guarded silence. The residents, some of whom had occupied these stately colonials since the 1970s, seemed to retreat behind their velvet curtains. There was an unspoken code of conduct in this affluent enclave, a belief that bringing the darkness into the light would somehow stain the reputation of the entire street. This collective silence acted as a secondary soundproofing system for the Watcher, providing a layer of protection that no surveillance camera could penetrate. Every search effort was thwarted by minor, frustrating errors or the sheer lack of a starting point. The police looked into the history of the house, scrutinizing the lives of previous owners and rejected buyers who might have harbored a grudge. They sat in unmarked cars at 2 a.m, watching the house through the leaves of the ancient oaks, waiting for a figure to emerge with an envelope in hand. But the Watcher was more patient than the law. The predator understood the rhythms of the police patrols as well as they understood the rhythms of the Broaddus family. The isolation grew as the family realized that the authorities were chasing a ghost. The community's desire to maintain an image of perfect safety became a hurdle that justice simply could not clear. Every time a new letter arrived, filled with even more intimate details about the children's nicknames or the specific furniture being moved into the house, it was a direct, mocking taunt to the detectives. The predator was proving that in a town built on the concept of home as a sanctuary, they were the ones who truly held the keys. As the investigation stalled, the Broaddus family found themselves alone in a house that felt less like a home and more like a brightly lit stage, where an invisible audience was waiting for the final act. The extreme tension within the Broaddus family reached a breaking point as the summer of 2014 bled into a humid, suffocating autumn. Every morning, the simple act of checking the mail felt like reaching into a nest of vipers. Maria Broaddus found herself unable to breathe until the metal flap of the mailbox had clicked shut and she had scanned the envelopes for that telltale, heavy ivory cardstock. The turning point arrived when a third letter was delivered, one that stripped away any remaining hope of a misunderstanding. This correspondence was far more aggressive, claiming that the house was crying out for the children to move into the basement so the Watcher could be closer to them. The predator was no longer just observing, they were demanding the fresh blood they had promised in their very first note. In a desperate bid for an escape, Derek and Maria poured their life savings into a private security detail and a team of former federal investigators. They lived in a state of constant, vibrating alertness, waiting for a moment of negligence from their tormentor. They discovered a potential lead when a neighbor was spotted sitting in a lawn chair day after day, staring directly at the front door of 657 Boulevard. It was a chilling realization that the gap in the predator's armor might be their own brazenness. However, when the police intervened, the lead dissolved into nothingness. There was no physical evidence, no ink-stained fingers, and no ivory paper found in the neighbor's home. Jiayi. The family's true discovery was that they were trapped in a financial and psychological cage. They tried to sell the home just months after buying it, but the story had infected the town like a virus. Potential buyers were terrified, and the house sat empty, its beautiful windows looking out like unblinking eyes at a street that had turned its back on them. A belated intervention came in the form of a lawsuit filed by the Broaddus family against the previous owners, alleging that they had received a letter from the Watcher before the sale and had deliberately hidden the truth to ensure the deal went through. It was a final, frantic attempt to claw back their lives from a nightmare that had no physical form, yet held their entire future hostage. The aftermath of the events at 657 Boulevard is a haunting study in the futility of seeking justice against a ghost. The house that was meant to be a forever home stood as a silent, shingle-style monument to a dream that was systematically dismantled by a pen. Derek and Maria Broaddus never moved into the property. They spent 5 years paying a mortgage on a house they were too terrified to inhabit, while the Watcher continued to send occasional mocking reminders of their presence. The sensory details of their ordeal remained vivid. The metallic clack of the mail slot, the scent of fresh paint that now smelled only of stagnation, and the chilling cold that seemed to radiate from the basement they were warned never to enter. In 2019, the family finally managed to sell the property for $1.25 million, a staggering loss of $400,000 from their original purchase price. The fate of the individuals involved is one of lingering trauma. While they moved to a new home in a different town, the psychological scars remained unhealed. The perpetrator achieved a dark, absolute victory. They successfully defended their house from the fresh blood and remained an anonymous shadow in the fabric of Westfield. No one was ever arrested, no DNA was ever matched, and the identity of the sender remains a chilling blank space in the annals of New Jersey crime. The lesson of the Boulevard is a grim one. Sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one who breaks your window, but the one who simply watches you through it. But as the world moves deeper into the 21st century, the shadows are no longer confined to the houses on our streets. They have migrated into the very devices we carry in our pockets. We move now from the physical walls of a New Jersey colonial to the shimmering glass skyscrapers of Hong Kong in 2024. In a world where seeing is no longer believing, a single employee would enter a routine video conference only to find themselves face-to-face with a room full of ghosts and a digital heist that would vanish $25.6 million into the ether. The city of Hong Kong in early 2024 was a sprawling, vertical labyrinth of neon, glass, and constant motion. It is a place where time is measured in millisecond trades, and the air itself seems to vibrate with the sheer friction of wealth moving through the ether. Inside one of the many shimmering towers that pierce the humid clouds of the financial district, a finance employee began his Tuesday morning with the same rhythmic, comforting rituals he had performed for years. He settled into his ergonomic chair, the fabric sighing under his weight. He adjusted his dual monitors, the blue light reflecting in his eyes like a digital sunrise. He took a slow sip of lukewarm tea, the steam dampening his face as he watched the morning's first batch of emails cascade into his inbox. This was the pinnacle of corporate normalcy, a world of invoices, spreadsheets, and predictable protocols where every variable was accounted for and every transaction followed a strict, logical path. To his colleagues sitting in the adjacent cubicles, he was just another focused professional in a well-oiled machine. They saw a man dedicated to his craft, perhaps a bit weary from the unrelenting pace of the international markets, but entirely secure within the fortified digital walls of his multinational employer. This was his professional neighborhood, a community of high-stakes finance where trust was not just expected, it was built into the very code of their communication systems. The hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards provided a soundtrack of safety, convincing everyone in the room that the dangers of the world were kept firmly on the other side of the firewalls. But while the employee was settling into the familiar comfort of his routine, a predator was already inside the building, not through a forced door or a compromised security badge, but through the very fiber optic cables that connected him to his colleagues across the globe. The mask this predator wore was the most trusted and powerful face in the entire organization, the chief financial officer. To the employee, the CFO was a distant, almost mythic figure of authority, a man whose directives carried the weight of billions and whose presence in a meeting commanded immediate, unquestioning respect. The neighbor's view of this predator was nothing more than the respected reputation of a corporate titan. No one suspected that behind the upcoming digital invitation and the familiar icons on the screen, there was no human soul at all. Instead, there was an intricate, hollow shell of mathematics and generative algorithms, a digital phantom that had been meticulously trained to mimic every blink, every subtle micro-expression, and every cadence of a man the employee had been taught to obey. The predator had not just stolen a face, they had hijacked the very concept of reality in a world where the line between the human and the synthetic was beginning to dissolve into a haze of pixels. As the notification for a group video conference chimed softly on his desktop, the employee reached for his headset, unaware that he was about to step into a digital trap designed to vanish $25.6 million into the shadows. The sudden incident did not arrive with the screech of tires or the splintering of a doorframe, but with the soft, melodic chime of a video conference notification pinging against the sterile silence of the office. In the year 2024, this was the heartbeat of corporate life. A digital summons that demanded immediate attention. The finance employee, a man who prided himself on his vigilance, adjusted his headset and clicked the join button, expecting a routine briefing on the quarter's projections. As the screen flickered to life, the illusion was total and terrifyingly beautiful. There, in high-definition clarity, sat the chief financial officer, looking exactly as he did in every annual report and televised interview, composed, authoritative, and draped in the quiet confidence of a man who moved mountains of capital with a single nod. Beside him, in the virtual tiles, were several other colleagues, familiar faces from the London and New York offices, each blinking and nodding in the low light of their respective digital workspaces. The CFO's voice, a deep and measured baritone, traveled through the employee's headset with a warmth that felt entirely human, greeting him by name before transitioning into the urgent business at hand. The request was massive, yet delivered with a clinical banality that bypassed the employee's internal alarms. The CFO explained that a secret, high-priority transaction required an immediate transfer of funds to several offshore accounts. The sum was staggering, $25.6 million. In that split second, the grab occurred not a physical seizure, but a psychological one. The employee saw his superiors, heard their voices, and felt the immense pressure of their collective gaze. There was no static, no digital artifacts, and no robotic lag to betray the fact that he was the only living soul in a room full of ghosts. The initial chaos was a silent digital hemorrhage. With a few practiced keystrokes and the scan of a security fob, the employee authorized the release of the capital. He watched the progress bar on his monitor crawl from 0 to 100%, a tiny blue line representing the total erasure of a fortune. As the transfer complete notification flashed on the screen, the CFO offered a brief professional smile of thanks before the call abruptly ended, leaving the employee staring at his own reflection in the black glass of the monitor. The $25.6 million had vanished into the labyrinth of the global banking system, moving at the speed of light toward accounts that were as fabricated as the faces on his screen. It was a disappearance without a trace, a scream for help muffled by the perfect artificial silence of the deepfake. The predator's secret basement was not a physical room with damp concrete walls and heavy iron locks. It was a digital fortress built from flickering rows of green code and the stolen fragments of public lives. To understand the dark side of this specific predator, we have to look into the windowless server rooms where the ghosts were born. This was not a crime of opportunity or a sudden impulse, but a long-form construction of a lie so perfect it could bypass every human instinct for survival. The preparation began with the cold, systematic harvesting of an identity. Imagine the predator sitting in the haunting blue light of 3 different monitors, watching every public appearance the chief financial officer had ever made. They didn't just want his face. They wanted the mechanical truth of his existence. They fed his voice every pause, every intake of breath, every unique inflection into a deep learning algorithm. They taught a machine to blink exactly when he would blink, to adjust a tie with the same rhythmic, nervous habit, and to look into a camera with the same piercing, spawn, authoritative gaze that had built a multi-billion-dollar empire. This was the digital equivalent of soundproofing a cell. By creating not just one, but a dozen digital phantoms of other employees, they ensured that the victim would feel surrounded by a familiar and undeniable reality. They studied the company's internal hierarchy with surgical precision, identifying the exact finance employee who possessed the administrative power to move $25,600,000, but who occupied a social circle far enough from the executive suite that he wouldn't realize the personality of the digital chief financial officer was entirely hollow. The secret room was the video conference itself. It was a psychological cage where the predator controlled every single pixel and every sound wave reaching the victim's ears. They meticulously mapped out the timing of the meeting to coincide with a period of high corporate stress, ensuring the employee would be too focused on his professional duties to notice the unnatural smoothness of a digital chin or the way a shadow didn't quite move in sync with a synthetic hand. This was a meticulously prepared trap where the bars were made of duty and the locks were forged from the terrifyingly real faces of people the victim trusted. They were ready to commit a heist of $25,600,000 without ever touching a single physical dollar. The realization did not arrive as a thunderclap, but as a slow, sickening chill that began in the pit of the employee's stomach and crawled up his spine like a trail of ice. It happened on a Wednesday morning, 24 hours after the digital phantoms had vanished from his screen. The office was bathed in the usual clinical fluorescent glow, and the air carried the faint, ozone-sweet scent of humming servers and overpriced espresso. The employee, still buoyed by the perceived success of the high-priority mission, sent a brief, professional follow-up email to the chief financial officer's actual assistant, inquiring about the confirmation of the $25,600,000 transfer. He expected a routine acknowledgement, perhaps a digital nod of approval for his efficiency in the face of such a monumental request. Instead, the response was a void. Then, a phone call. The voice on the other end was not the measured baritone of the digital ghost he had spoken to the day before, but the sharp, confused tone of the real CFO's executive assistant in the London office. They had no record of a meeting. They had no record of a secret project. And they certainly had no record of a request to move $25,600,000 into a series of offshore accounts. In that moment, the cubicle walls seemed to press inward, and the blue light of the monitors became a mocking electric glare. The social barrier of the corporate hierarchy, which had served as the predator's primary camouflage, now became a wall of shame. The police deadlock began the moment the Hong Kong Cybersecurity and Technology Crime Bureau entered the shimmering glass lobby of the multinational firm. The investigators were men and women who lived in a world of packets, headers, and encrypted handshakes, yet even they were staggered by the sheer audacity of the architecture they encountered. They sat in the company's high-tech boardroom, the air thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the metallic tang of high-end hardware, staring at a screen that showed nothing. The predators had not just stolen the money, they had cleaned the digital crime scene with the precision of a surgical team. Every search effort was thwarted by the power of the phantom. The investigators pored over the company's logs, tracing the invitation for the video call back to its source, only to find themselves staring at a series of compromised servers in 3 different countries, none of which kept logs for more than an hour. The digital trail was not a path. It was a series of dissolving footprints in a virtual tide. They looked for social engineering errors, a misspelled word in an email, a slight lag in the video stream, but the AI had been too perfect. It had mimicked the CFO's specific cadence and his habit of adjusted his glasses with such fidelity that the human eye, trained for decades to trust its peers, had been completely bypassed. The psychological barrier was perhaps the most formidable obstacle. How do you prosecute a ghost? How do you issue a warrant for a sequence of algorithms that have already been deleted from a remote server? The Hong Kong police found themselves in a deadlock of technology versus law. The money that $25,600,000 had been fragmented into thousands of tiny digital shards almost the instant it hit the initial accounts. It had been tumbled through cryptocurrency mixers, hidden behind layers of private keys and anonymous wallets that no traditional banking authority could penetrate. The community of Hong Kong's financial elite watched the investigation with a guarded, terrifying silence. This was the social barrier in action, a collective fear that admitting such a vulnerability would cause the entire house of cards to collapse. The company, desperate to protect its reputation and its stock price, initially hesitated to share the full details of the breach, creating a delay that allowed the predators to finish laundering the final few million. By the time the full weight of the law was brought to bear, the ghosts had not just left the building, they had ceased to exist in the physical world entirely. The investigators were left standing in a room full of expensive monitors, looking at a $25,600,000 hole in the world that no amount of traditional detective work could ever fill. The silence that followed the end of that video conference in early 2024 was not the peaceful silence of a job well done. It was a heavy, static-filled void that seemed to vibrate within the walls of the Hong Kong office. The finance employee sat at his desk, his fingers still hovering over the keyboard, his heart performing a slow, rhythmic thud against his ribs that felt out of sync with the quiet humming of the computer fans. On his screen, the gallery of faces, the chief financial officer and his trusted colleagues had vanished in a sudden, sharp snap of black pixels. He was left staring at his own reflection in the monitor, a pale, flickering ghost of a man who had just moved $25,600,000 with the simple press of a button. In that moment, the predator's negligence was not found in a physical error, but in the absolute, clinical perfection of the illusion they had created. There was no follow-up. No congratulatory email from the CFO thanking him for his discretion. No final human touch to anchor the massive transaction in reality. It was as if the entire executive board of the multinational corporation had simply ceased to exist the moment the task was complete. The turning point arrived approximately 5 hours later. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged, neon-lit skyline of the city, casting long, bruised shadows across the employee's desk. He decided to send a routine encrypted message to the internal account of one of the colleagues he had just seen on the call, a woman in the London office who had nodded supportively as the CFO gave the orders. He typed a short, professional note confirming the secondary verification for the transfer we discussed earlier. Thank you for the guidance. He waited. The typing bubble appeared, then vanished. Then it appeared again. The response that finally materialized on his screen was the random fluke that shattered the digital ceiling of his reality. His colleague wrote back, "What transfer? I haven't been in a meeting today. I've been out of the office on a personal matter for the last 6 hours." The employee's breath hitched in his throat. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, tasting of ozone and a cold, metallic panic. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling so violently that he nearly dropped the device. He called the headquarters. He bypassed the usual gatekeepers and demanded to speak with the office of the chief financial officer. The discovery was a slow-motion car crash of realization. The real CFO had not been in a video conference. He had been in a closed-door meeting in a completely different time zone. The faces the employee had seen, the voices he had heard, the specific reassuring cadences of men he had known for years were nothing but empty, synthetic shells. Every single person in that digital room, with the exception of the victim himself, had been a deepfake. The belated intervention began with the arrival of the Hong Kong Cybersecurity and Technology Crime Bureau, but the escape had already been executed by the perpetrators. As the forensic teams plugged their devices into the office's infrastructure, the employee realized that no matter how resilient he had been in his career, he had been thwarted by a predator that exploited his own loyalty and his own eyes. The gap in the predator's plan wasn't a technical failure. It was the simple fact that human beings still talk to each other outside of the room. But by the time that casual internal message had been sent and received, the $25,600,000 had already been fragmented, laundered, and spirited away into the dark, untraceable corners of the global financial web. Custom gem. The aftermath of the digital heist in Hong Kong was a chilling electronic silence that vibrated through the steel and glass of the financial district. The $25,600,000 did not just leave the company's accounts. It disintegrated into 1 million digital shards, scattered across 1,000 anonymous wallets in a dozen different countries almost the instant the transfer was authorized. No matter how many forensic experts leaned over their glowing monitors, or how many international warrants were issued, the money remained as ghostly and unreachable as the faces in that video conference. Justice in this new frontier was not a heavy hammer, but a shrug of professional futility from investigators who realized they were chasing a ghost made of mathematics. The fate of the finance employee was a particular kind of modern purgatory. He was a man who had performed his duties with a level of loyalty and efficiency that was ultimately used to hollow out his professional life. Though he was not charged with a crime, the weight of being the hand that moved a fortune into the void is a burden that no amount of corporate reassurances can ever truly lift. He remains a living warning, a man who looked into the eyes of his superiors and saw only a cold, algorithmic lie. The company itself was forced to reconcile with the terrifying reality that their multi-billion-dollar security systems had a single unsolvable flaw: the human desire to trust what it sees. The lesson learned by the world in 2024 was one of profound technological paranoia. We have officially entered an era where our own senses can no longer be used to verify the reality of the people we work with or the directives we follow. The strange, dark, and mysterious has evolved into a form that requires no physical presence, no hidden basement, and no tracks in the snow. It simply requires a high-speed connection and a target who believes that a face on a screen is a soul in the world. But while the ghosts in Hong Kong were constructed from code and light, there are other phantoms that manifest in the physical world. People who step into the biting cold of a winter night and simply cease to exist in the time it takes for a single breath. To find our final story, we must leave the neon glow of the skyscrapers and travel to a desolate, winding road in New Hampshire in the year 2004. We are looking for a young woman who was there one moment, standing by her wrecked car in the fresh snow, and then, in the blink of an eye, was gone forever, leaving behind only the sound of the wind and a mystery that has refused to thaw for over 20 years. The air in Amherst, Massachusetts, in early February of 2004 was the kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin, it bit into your bones. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, the campus was a rhythmic machine of academic normalcy. Students moved between brick buildings like a slow, woolen tide, their faces buried in scarves, their minds occupied by the looming pressure of midterms and the mundane stress of young adulthood. Among them was 21-year-old Maura Murray. Maura was the personification of a high achiever, a gifted nursing student, a standout runner with a disciplined stride, and someone who seemed to have the blueprints of her entire life laid out in front of her. To those who saw her in the hallways or passed her on the jogging trails, she was a picture of focused stability. She was the daughter who called home, the student who studied until the library lights flickered, and the athlete who pushed through the pain. In her dormitory room, the scene was one of quiet domestic routine. There were textbooks cracked open on the desk, the scent of lavender laundry detergent clinging to her sheets, and the soft hum of a computer monitor. This was the illusion of normalcy, a stage set with all the props of a successful life in progress. To her friends, she was just Maura, perhaps a bit stressed by the rigors of her clinical rotations, but fundamentally grounded. They saw her packing her backpack, heard her making plans for the weekend, and watched her navigate the typical social landscape of a university junior. No one saw a woman on the verge of vanishing. No one saw the cracks beginning to spiderweb through the glass of her daily life. But as the afternoon of February 9th, 2004, began to fade into a bruised purple twilight, Maura began a series of actions that moved with a strange internal logic. She packed a small bag. She withdrew nearly all the money from her bank account, $280. She stopped at a liquor store, purchasing a variety of spirits. And then, she climbed into her black 2000 Saturn sedan and turned the key. The engine turned over with a familiar metallic rattle, and she pulled away from the curb, leaving the safety of the campus behind. She wasn't headed to a class or a shift at the hospital. She was driving north, toward the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. As she crossed the state line, the world outside her window changed. The bustling, lighted streets of Massachusetts gave way to the deep, silent corridors of the New Hampshire woods. This landscape carried its own kind of mask, the mask of the wilderness. To a tourist, these roads are a scenic escape, a place of rustic charm and quiet beauty. But to those who live in the small, isolated towns tucked into the valleys, the woods are a vast, unblinking presence that knows how to keep a secret. The predator in this story is not necessarily a person with a name and a face, but the terrifyingly thin line between the known and the unknown. As Maura's car wound its way through the darkness of Route 112 in Haverhill, she was entering a neighborhood of shadows. The neighbors here were the towering pines and the jagged granite cliffs, and perhaps a figure watching from a darkened porch or a passing truck. In these rural stretches, everyone knows the turns of the road, and everyone knows that when a car slides off the asphalt into a snowbank, the isolation of the mountains becomes a physical weight. The mask of the quiet local or the helpful passerby is easy to wear when the nearest police officer is miles away and the only witness is the cold, biting wind. Maura Murray was driving toward a specific point in time and space where the normalcy of her life was about to collide with a silence that has not been broken for over 20 years. The night of February 9th, 2004, was a cold, starless vacuum that seemed to swallow the light of the few houses scattered along Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. At approximately 7:27 in the evening, the heavy, rhythmic silence of the wild Ammonoosuc Road was shattered by a sound that felt entirely out of place in the wilderness: the sharp, industrial crunch of metal meeting a frozen earth embankment. Maura Murray's black Saturn had failed to navigate a sharp S-curve, skidding across the icy asphalt and wedging itself into a snow-covered ditch. The sudden incident was not a violent explosion, but a muffled, heavy thud. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was the frantic, metallic clicking of the hazard lights and the soft, rhythmic hiss of steam escaping from a ruptured radiator. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of deployed airbags and the sharp, fruity tang of a box of wine that had burst during the impact. Maura sat in the driver's seat, the world spinning in a slow, dizzying circle of white snow and black trees. A local resident, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood, was pulling his large vehicle into his driveway just around the bend when he saw the glint of the Saturn's headlights. He approached the scene, the air from his bus's brakes letting out a long, mechanical sigh as he stepped out into the biting cold. He saw a young woman standing by the vehicle, shivering in the winter air. She looked shaken, but appeared physically unharmed. When he offered to call the police or a tow truck, she declined, her voice thin and tight with a strange, urgent kind of desperation. She told him she had already called the American Automobile Association, a claim that Butch knew was impossible, as there was no cell phone reception in that deep, granite-walled valley. Butch, feeling the prickle of unease at the base of his neck, told her he would go into his house and call for help anyway. He walked the short distance to his porch, the snow crunching beneath his boots, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the stillness. He was inside for no more than 7 to 10 minutes, navigating the mundane delay of a busy phone line. When the first police officer arrived on the scene at 7:46 in the evening, the initial chaos had been replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The Saturn was still there, its front end crumpled and its windshield cracked, but the driver's side door was shut. The hazard lights were still blinking their rhythmic orange warning into the darkness. But Maura Murray was gone. There were no screams that had reached Butch's ears. There were no sounds of a struggling engine or a screech of tires fleeing the scene. In the brief window between a neighbor walking to his phone and a cruiser arriving at the curve, a living, breathing human being had been erased from the road. The snow around the car was pristine, undisturbed by the heavy tread of a struggle or the frantic footprints of someone running into the woods. It was as if she had simply stepped off the map of the known world and into a void that the New Hampshire mountains had been holding open just for her. To understand the dark side of the predator in the case of Maura Murray, one must look past the physical landscape and into the meticulous, almost frantic preparation that preceded her final drive. The predator here might not have been a man in a white van, but the suffocating weight of a secret life that Maura was attempting to outrun. In the days before she vanished into the New Hampshire night, she had systematically dismantled the normalcy of her existence with the precision of someone preparing for a permanent departure. Her preparation was a series of calculated erasures. She had sent emails to her professors and supervisors at the University of Massachusetts, claiming there had been a death in her family, a statement that was a total fabrication. She was building a wall of silence behind her, ensuring that no one would go looking for her for at least a week. She packed her belongings into neat black garbage bags, leaving them piled in her dorm room like a collection of ghosts. She withdrew nearly every cent she had, $280. A sum that suggested she wasn't planning on a long-term relocation, but perhaps a desperate short-term escape. But if the predator was indeed a physical entity, their psychology was one of chilling, opportunistic patience. Imagine a figure who knows the winding, lightless corridors of Route 112 like the back of their own hand. A local man who understands that in these mountains, a car in a ditch is not an accident, but an invitation. This individual would not have needed a secret basement or a soundproofing system because the wilderness provided all the isolation they required. The dark side of this predator lies in the mask of the helpful neighbor. They would have seen a young woman alone, standing by a wrecked car in the sub-zero temperatures, and they would have known exactly how to present themselves as a savior while leading her into the dark. The preparation of such a predator would be the preparation of a hunter. They would know the dead zones where cell phones are useless. They would know the logging roads that lead deep into the granite heart of the mountains, places where the snow never thaws and the ground never gives up what it hides. If Maura was taken, she was taken by someone who understood the rhythmic timing of the local police patrols, someone who could move in that 7-minute window with the silence of a shadow. The most disturbing psychological aspect of this mystery is the silence of the community. In small, isolated towns, there is often a protective layer of soundproofing around those who have lived there for generations. If someone saw something that night, a strange truck idling by the curve or a figure being ushered into a passenger seat, the fear of the strange, dark, and mysterious often keeps those mouths shut. The predator's true strength was not a physical cage, but the vast, unblinking indifference of the woods and the terrifyingly short amount of time it takes to transform a person into a missing persons poster. The investigation into the disappearance of Maura Murray began not with a frantic search for a victim, but with the routine, almost bored observations of a small-town police officer responding to a minor traffic accident. When the first cruiser from the Haverhill Police Department arrived at the sharp S-curve on Route 112 at 7:46 in the evening, the scene appeared to be a textbook DWI walk away. The officer saw the black Saturn nose down in the snowbank, the hazard lights still pulsing their orange rhythm against the white drifts. He saw the deployed airbags and the cracked windshield, and inside, on the passenger seat, he noted the dark, purplish stain of spilled wine. The air smelled of cold rubber and fermentation. To the local authorities, this wasn't a kidnapping, it was a young person who had been drinking, hit a tree, and wandered off into the woods to avoid a ticket or a night in a cell. This initial assumption was the first and most critical minor error that led to a permanent police deadlock. Because the responding officer believed the driver would eventually turn up at a local motel or hitch a ride to a friend's house, the area around the car was not immediately treated as a crime scene. There were no yellow tapes fluttering in the wind, no forensic teams dusting the steering wheel for prints, and no immediate attempt to preserve the integrity of the snow surrounding the vehicle. By the time the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the White Mountains the following morning, the crime scene had been trampled by well-meaning neighbors and smoothed over by the relentless, drifting snow. The search efforts that followed were a masterclass in bureaucratic frustration. It wasn't until 36 hours later, when Maura's father, Fred, began making frantic phone calls from Massachusetts, that the police realized the girl from the Saturn hadn't just walked away, she had vanished. The true search began in earnest on the second day, involving bloodhounds, thermal imaging helicopters, and dozens of volunteers moving in a slow, methodical line through the dense New Hampshire brush. But the mountains remained stubbornly indifferent. The dogs, trained to pick up even the faintest trail of human scent, wandered aimlessly around the car before sitting down in the middle of the road, as if the trail had simply ascended into the sky. The most baffling element for the investigators was the physical impossibility of the scene. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from the car and into the woods. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded shoes, and no drops of blood on the pristine white surface. The psychological barrier for the police was the timeline itself. Maura had disappeared in a window of less than 10 minutes. To kidnap a grown woman, silence her, and move her from a public road without leaving a single mark in the fresh snow required a level of precision that felt almost supernatural. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation hit a wall of social silence. Haverhill and the surrounding towns are places where the residents are as rugged and unyielding as the granite they live upon. There is a deep-seated culture of privacy in rural New Hampshire, a live-free-or-die ethos that makes people wary of outsiders, especially men in uniforms, asking questions. The police knocked on doors and sat in living rooms that smelled of wood smoke and old wool, but they were met with a collective shrug. Neighbors who lived within earshot of the crash claimed they heard nothing but the wind. People who might have seen a strange car or a figure in the dark chose to look the other way, protecting their own peace over the life of a stranger from Massachusetts. This psychological isolation of the virtual and physical world became Maura's final cage. While her family begged for information on the evening news, the case file began to grow cold, buried under the weight of almosts and could-have-beens. The police were left with a locked car, a box of wine, and a 7-minute gap in reality that no amount of searching could ever fill. They were staring into a void that the mountains had created, a deadlock where the evidence was as thin as the winter air, and the truth was buried somewhere beneath a layer of ice that refused to melt. The extreme tension of that winter night was not born from a scream or the sound of a struggle, but from a silence so profound it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. When the first police officer pulled his cruiser alongside the crumpled black Saturn at 7:46 in the evening, the scene appeared frozen in time. The hazard lights were still blinking, casting a rhythmic orange glow across the pristine white snow that blanketed the roadside like a cold, heavy shroud. He expected to find a dazed driver, perhaps shivering in the sub-zero air or smelling of the wine that had splashed across the passenger floorboards, but as he peered through the glass, he saw only an empty seat and the ghost of a routine. The turning point of the entire mystery was the realization that in a window of less than 10 minutes, a living human being had seemingly stepped out of the physical world. The neighbor, Butch Atwood, had spoken to Maura just moments before, seeing her alive and seemingly unhurt by her vehicle. He had gone into his home for a matter of minutes to call for help, and by the time the blue and red lights of the law arrived, she was gone. There were no footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the car and into the dark, suffocating tree line of the White Mountains. There was no sign of a scuffle, no frantic marks in the slush, and no evidence that anyone had been forced into the woods. It was as if the road itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. A random fluke of the investigation occurred days later when search dogs were brought to the scene. They were given a scent from one of Maura's gloves, and they followed a trail for approximately 100 yards down the road, heading east, before the animals simply stopped in the middle of the pavement and looked up at their handlers. The scent had vanished into the biting air. This discovery led to the chilling theory that Maura had been picked up by a passing vehicle, perhaps by someone who saw a young woman in distress and offered a ride that turned into a one-way trip into the shadows. Belated interventions have continued for over 20 years, with investigators and private search parties returning to those woods time and again. They have used thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis on every scrap of bone or clothing found in the area, yet the mystery remains as impenetrable as the granite mountains themselves. No matter how many times the files are reopened or the evidence is re-examined, the silence of that 7-minute window in 2004 remains an absolute terrifying void. The aftermath of the disappearance on Route 112 in New Hampshire remains one of the most haunting voids in the history of modern mysteries. For over 2 decades, the name Maura Murray has become synonymous with the terrifying fragility of a human life. The fate of the individual at the center of this story is a chilling blank space. Despite the passage of 20 years, not a single piece of clothing, a stray hair, or a definitive footprint has ever been recovered from the unforgiving granite terrain. The search for the 21-year-old nursing student transformed from a frantic rescue mission into a lifelong pilgrimage for her father, Fred Murray, who has spent countless winters walking the same snowy curve, his breath blooming in the cold as he calls out to a daughter who never answers. The investigation remains a monument to absolute futility. No charges were ever filed, no suspects were ever officially named, and the case has settled into a permanent, icy deadlock. The sensory details of that night, the sharp, metallic scent of the wrecked Saturn, the rhythmic orange pulsing of the hazard lights, and the heavy, pine-scented silence of the woods continue to haunt the local community and the digital world alike. The realization that a woman could vanish into thin air in a window of less than 10 minutes has turned that stretch of road into a place of quiet, superstitious dread. The lesson of Maura Murray is a grim reminder that the safety we feel in our routines is often nothing more than a thin, painted veil. We assume that if we fall, someone will hear us. We believe that if we disappear, we will leave a trail. But as the snow continues to fall over the White Mountains, it covers more than just the asphalt. It buries the truth beneath layers of time and indifference. Justice, in this case, has not been a hammer, but a fading echo in a valley that refuses to give up its secrets. These 5 stories, from the locked freezers of Ohio to the digital ghosts of Hong Kong and the silent snows of New Hampshire, all share a single, terrifying thread. They remind us that the strange, dark, and mysterious is not a distant land, but a shadow that walks beside us every day. Whether it is a neighbor waving from across the street or a face on a glowing screen, the world is full of masks. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is believe that you truly know who is standing behind them. As the final echoes of these stories fade, I want you to take a long, deep breath. The journey through the shadows of Youngstown and the frozen fields of Bavaria is officially over. The heavy, locked doors of the Ohio basement have been left behind, and the unsettling letters from the boulevard have been folded away into the past. The digital phantoms of Hong Kong have dissolved back into the static, and the winding, snowy roads of New Hampshire are now miles and miles away from where you are right now. You are safe, you are in your own space, and the strange, dark, and mysterious has retreated back into the night, leaving you in total peace. I want you to feel the weight of your body pressing gently, deeply into your bed. Feel your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take another slow breath in, and as you exhale, let go of the tension in your hands, your legs, and your mind. Your room is a sanctuary, the doors are secure, the world is quiet, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. Imagine now that you are walking away from those dark, uncertain streets and into a forest of soft silver mist. The ground beneath your feet is made of cool, damp moss that cushions every step. There are no watchers here, no secrets hidden in the shadows, only the gentle, rhythmic hum of the trees and the scent of rain-washed pine. The mist wraps around you like a heavy, warm blanket, lulling you into a state of absolute stillness. Your eyelids are becoming very, very heavy. The stories are gone. The world is at peace. Sleep well. Good night.